There is a particular cruelty in giving a person a place to die and calling it a gift. It is the poison of hope, offered in a beautiful cup, a final turning of the screw upon a soul already stretched to its breaking point. This was the nature of the deed they pressed into Adeline's hand, a worthless acreage clinging to the stony face of the mountain, a place known only for its wind and its shadows. They gave it to her not to live, but to disappear. They gave her a tomb and called it a home, never imagining that the earth itself remembers what men choose to forget, and that the deepest stone holds the most persistent warmth. The paper felt like a sliver of ice in her palm, a stark contrast to the memory of her husband's hand, once so warm and vital in hers. Her in-laws, Martha and John, stood before her on the porch of the house that was no longer hers, their faces masks of brittle grief. It was a grief so sharp it had no room for softness, no room for the young widow of their only son, or for the small boy who stood clutching her skirts, his eyes wide with a confusion that mirrored her own. It was Daniel's folly, John said, his voice gravelly, avoiding her gaze. He bought it years ago. Poured good money into a hole in the ground. It's all that's left. Martha's lips were a thin, bloodless line. There's a cave. You can shelter there. It's more than some have. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken accusation. You are still breathing, and he is not. This is your portion. Adeline looked from their closed-off faces to the distant, brooding mountain that loomed over the town of Providence. She saw the small, dark mark on its flank that she knew was the cave. She thought of the whispers that had followed her since the funeral, the sharp glances from Beatrice, the town's self-appointed arbiter of propriety, whose pity felt more like a judgment. She thought of her son, Thomas, who deserved more than a legacy of shame. And a cold, hard resolve, something she hadn't felt since Daniel's last breath, began to form in her heart. She would not collapse. She would not fade. She would take their tomb and she would make it breathe. Thank you, she said, her voice quiet but clear, and the single phrase was not a surrender, but a declaration of war. With her son's hand in one hand and the leash of Kaiser, her loyal German shepherd, in the other, she walked away from the town, toward the mountain, not looking back. The memory of him was a physical ache, a phantom limb she reached for in the night. Daniel had not been a man of grand pronouncements, but of quiet, steady certainties. One of those certainties had been the mountain. He had loved it with a devotion that baffled his practical parents. It's not just rock, Addie, he told her on one of their first courtships, his hand sweeping toward the formidable peak. It's old. It remembers things. There's a piece up there the valley doesn't know. He had taken her to the cave, a wide, yawning mouth of granite that smelled of damp stone and deep time. Inside, the air was still and cool, a respite from the summer sun. He'd paced its dimensions, his hands tracing the contours of the walls as if reading a language only he understood. A man could build a life here, he'd murmured, his eyes alight with a dreamer's fire. A real life. Not just a ledger book and a town lot. His parents, John and Martha, had seen it as a foolish obsession, a drain on the money they hoped he would use to build a respectable business in town. They had argued, their voices a low, angry hum that Adeline had overheard from the porch, a clash between the earthbound and the visionary. Then the sickness had come, a quiet thief that stole the strength from his limbs and the breath from his lungs. The dream of the mountain was the first thing to go, relinquished in the face of fevers and doctors' grim pronouncements. His surrender had pleased his parents, but Adeline had seen the light go out of his eyes long before his heart finally gave way. Now, standing at the mouth of that same cave, the deed in her pocket, she understood the cruelty of their gift more deeply. They were giving her the ghost of his dead dream, the very thing they had shamed him for, a place they associated only with his defiance and their disappointment. They had cast her out not just from their lives, but into the heart of a memory they could not bear. The cave was no longer a place of peace, it was a monument to a battle he had lost. As Kaiser whined softly, pressing his great head against her leg, and Thomas looked up at her, his small face etched with worry, Adeline pressed her own hand against the cold, unyielding stone. It felt like touching the face of her grief. But then, a strange thing happened. Deeper, beneath the surface chill, she felt a faint, resonant vibration. A thrum of ancient energy. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was something solid. Something that had endured. A man's life is often measured by what he leaves behind, but a truer measure might be who he leaves behind, and how they learn to carry on. Samuel was a man who had outlived everyone he loved. He found Adeline on his third day on the mountain, a wraith of a woman hauling fallen timber with a desperation that was painful to watch. He had a face like a riverbed, carved with the lines of droughts and floods, and eyes that had seen too much to be shocked by the sight of a widow and a child trying to make a home in a rock. He carried the loss of his own son, a boy taken by a fever 30 winters past, as a quiet space inside him. He saw in Adeline not a fool, but a reflection of his own stubborn refusal to yield. He approached not with offers of help, which he knew her pride would refuse, but with knowledge, which was a currency she could accept. "The stone is your friend, not your enemy," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. He placed a gnarled hand on the cave wall. "This granite holds the sun's heat long after the sun is gone. You build against the south wall, you'll have a winter hearth that never goes cold." He showed her the subtle seams in the rock where water wept through, a clean, reliable source that pooled in a natural basin deep inside. He taught her which woods burned hot and fast, and which burned slow and long. "The earth doesn't care for your sorrow," he told her one afternoon, watching her split logs with a grim, rhythmic fury. "But it will answer your labor." Always under his tutelage, the cave began to transform from a hollow space into the blueprint of a home. Adeline stopped seeing it as Daniel's tomb and started seeing it as her fortress. The work was brutal. Her hands, once soft, became a cartography of blisters and calluses. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. But with every log she hauled, every stone she cleared, a piece of the suffocating grief was chipped away, replaced by the solid, satisfying ache of exhaustion. Thomas, at first timid, began to follow the old man, listening to his stories of the land. Kaiser, ever watchful, seemed to accept Samuel's presence as part of their new, strange pack. The mountain was no longer just a place of exile, it was becoming a place of instruction. There is a unique solace in construction, in the slow and certain rise of a shelter built by one's own hands. It is an argument against chaos, a tangible prayer for a future. For Adeline, the cabin inside the cave became her catechism. She worked from the first hint of dawn until the last vestiges of light faded from the cave mouth. Samuel had shown her where to find a stand of straight, tall pines felled by a windstorm years ago, seasoned and ready. Getting them to the cave was a Herculean task. She used a system of levers and ropes, her body straining, Kaiser sometimes pulling alongside her as if he understood the geometry of the struggle. One day, Finn, a young man from a neighboring farm down in the valley, rode up the trail. He saw her, a lone woman, wrestling a log twice her size. He saw the raw desperation and the sheer force of will. He stopped his horse, his hands tightening on the reins. Adeline paused, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and met his eyes. She saw the conflict there, the human impulse to help warring with the fear of community censure, of being seen aiding the outcast. He gave a short, jerky nod, then spurred his horse on, disappearing down the path. A hot, bitter anger flared in Adeline's chest. The rejection was sharper than any insult Beatrice could have hurled. It was the quiet betrayal of a neighbor. She turned back to the log, her jaw set. She did not need him. She did not need any of them. The cabin rose slowly, painstakingly. She laid a foundation of flat stones, creating a floor that was level and dry. The walls went up, notched and fitted with a precision born of Samuel's instruction and her own intense focus. It was a small structure, just one room, but it was hers. It was solid. It was real. In a patch of earth near the cave mouth, where the afternoon sun reached for a few precious hours, she and Thomas planted a small garden. Samuel had shown her how to enrich the thin mountain soil with leaf mold and guano from a nearby bat roost. They planted potatoes, hardy greens, and beans that could climb the rock face. As she pressed the seeds into the dark, cool earth, Thomas beside her, his small hands mimicking hers, she felt a flicker of something she had not felt in a year, a fragile, tentative hope. The past is never truly buried. It is merely folded into the earth, waiting for the right hands to unearth it, to read its faded ink and remember its intent. Adeline was digging a post hole for the cabin's small porch when her shovel struck something that was not rock. It made a dull, metallic thud. Curiosity overriding her exhaustion, she knelt and clawed at the dirt with her bare hands. She unearthed a small, tin box, rusted at the seams but still solid. A tremor went through her. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this was Daniel's. With trembling fingers, she pried open the lid. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, was a folded sheaf of papers and a small, leather-bound journal. The papers were a map, but not of the surface. It was a detailed drawing of the cave system, far more extensive than she had realized. It showed the main chamber, the water seep, and then, drawn with a confident hand, a narrow passage she hadn't noticed, leading to a second, smaller chamber. Beside it, Daniel had written, geothermal vent. The heart of the mountain stays warm here. It was the secret he had sensed but never fully discovered. Beneath the map was a letter, his familiar script, a sudden, sharp blow to her heart. It was not addressed to her. It was addressed to a future keeper of this place. He wrote of his dream, of the peace he found in the stone, of his belief that this small piece of the world was a sanctuary. If you are reading this, the letter concluded, it means I could not build the life I imagined here. It means the world pulled me another way. Do not mourn what I lost. Instead, build. Build something true. This place will hold you if you let it. The earth is a patient guardian. Adeline sank back on her heels, the letter clutched in her hand, tears finally blurring her vision. It was not a ghost she had been given, but a benediction. This wasn't the site of his failure, it was the repository of his faith. The cabin, the garden, her raw hands, it was all an unwitting answer to this prayer he had buried in the dirt. He had not known who would find it, but he had trusted them. He had trusted her. She pressed the papers to her chest, the secrets of the mountain and the steadfast love of her husband held there, a shield against the coming cold. Nature does not issue warnings. It simply is, and then it acts. The first snows of October came early, a light dusting that melted by noon. But it was a harbinger. By mid-November, the sky turned a flat, bruised grey and did not change. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that seemed to snake its way into the very bones of the mountain. Then the snow began. It was not a gentle flurry but a thick, determined onslaught, a white curtain being drawn across the world. Adeline watched from the mouth of her cave, the small, sturdy cabin behind her a bastion of warmth against the encroaching chaos. She had stockpiled wood until the stacks reached the cave ceiling. Her small garden was harvested, the potatoes and winter greens stored in a cold niche in the rock. She was ready. Or so she thought. For 3 days, the snow fell without ceasing. The world beyond her shelter was erased, replaced by a swirling vortex of white. The town of Providence vanished. The valley vanished. The very concept of a world beyond her stone fortress seemed to dissolve. Then, on the 4th night, as the blizzard reached its zenith, Thomas began to cough. It was a dry, rasping sound that quickly deepened. By morning, he was burning with fever, his small body limp and his breathing shallow. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Adeline's carefully constructed armor of resolve. It was a terror far greater than any she had felt facing down her in-laws or the judgment of the town. This was a foe she could not fight with an axe or with stubbornness. She was alone. The snow was 8 feet deep on the trail, a suffocating blanket. There were no doctors, no neighbors, no help. There was only the howling wind, the endless snow, and the terrifying, rattling sound of her son's breath in the sudden, profound silence of their stone sanctuary. She held him close, piling furs on his small frame, but the heat radiating from him was a fire she could not quench. She thought, I survived his father's death. She thought, I built a home from nothing. She thought, I cannot lose him, too. There are secrets that weigh upon a man's soul, not because they are evil, but because they are born of another's pain. Reverend Miller had carried such a secret for a year, and the weight had become unbearable. He was a good man, but a timid one, more comfortable with scripture than with confrontation. When the storm hit, his first thought had been for the old man, Samuel, and his second, with a pang of guilt, was for the widow on the mountain. He had watched her exile with a sense of profound shame, knowing more of the story than anyone else. As the blizzard raged, he could not shake the image of her and the boy, alone in the cold. He had to try. It took him hours, struggling through drifts that were over his head, following the line of the mountain that he knew by heart. He was near collapse when he saw it, a thin, impossible plume of smoke rising from the snow-covered flank of the mountain. It was a sign of life where none should be. He stumbled into the cave mouth, covered in snow, his beard frozen solid, and stared. He saw not a desperate hovel, but a warm, well-lit cabin. He saw Adeline, her face pale with fear, cradling her feverish son by a roaring fire. "Reverend," she breathed, her voice tight with shock and a sliver of hope. He explained he was checking on Samuel, but his eyes were on the boy. After offering what little medical knowledge he had, a useless poultice and a prayer, the confession he had held for so long finally spilled out of him. "It's not just grief, Adeline," he said, his voice low and heavy. "It's shame. John and Martha, they pushed him. They pushed Daniel so hard to give up this land, to take over the mercantile. They told him it was his duty." He paused, the firelight casting deep shadows on his face. "When he got sick, he couldn't fight them anymore." He agreed. And they felt they had won. But when he died, they knew. They knew they had taken his last dream from him for nothing. They look at you, and they see their own guilt. They sent you here to bury their shame, not just you. The truth settled in the small cabin, as profound and silent as the snow outside. It did not lessen the cruelty, but it gave it a human face. It was the desperate, ugly act of two people so consumed by their own regret that they had to create a villain to absolve themselves. A great storm does not only destroy, it also reveals. It scours the landscape, stripping away all that is false and leaving only what is essential. When the blizzard finally broke after 7 days, the world was remade in white. The town of Providence was a collection of snowbound lumps, its people isolated, cold, and running low on supplies. Up on the mountain, Adeline's fire still burned. Thomas's fever had broken, his breathing easing into the deep, steady rhythm of sleep. The revelation from the Reverend had not offered comfort, but clarity. Her anger, once a diffuse heat, now had a precise target, not simple cruelty, but the tangled, thorny knot of pride and guilt. On the second day after the storm, a small party of figures appeared, struggling up the trail they were forced to dig as they went. It was John and Martha, their faces haggard, followed by a humbled-looking Beatrice and a few other townsfolk. Their own homes were damaged, their firewood dwindling. They had come to the cave as a last resort, expecting to find frozen bodies. Instead, they found life. They stepped into the cave mouth and stopped, speechless. They saw the neat, solid cabin, the warm glow of lamplight from its window, the scent of wood smoke and hot broth. They saw Adeline, standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. And through the open door, they saw Thomas, small but alive, asleep under a pile of furs. Martha's carefully constructed composure shattered. A dry, ragged sob escaped her lips. She saw the impossible. She saw a thriving home where she had willed a grave. John stared past her at the axe propped against the cabin wall, the same axe he had given Daniel for his 18th birthday. He saw the neat stacks of firewood, the evidence of relentless, back-breaking labor. It was a testament to a strength he had never imagined she possessed. Just then, another figure appeared. It was Finn, pulling a small sled laden with sacks of flour, salted meat, and a bundle of blankets. He met Adeline's eyes, and this time, he did not look away. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I should have helped before." It was in that moment, surrounded by her humbled antagonists and her redeemed ally, that Adeline knew the war was over. Forgiveness is rarely a single, dramatic moment. More often, it is a slow, quiet accumulation of small acts, a gradual rebuilding of trust on the scorched earth of a past hurt. In the weeks that followed the great storm, the cave became an unlikely nexus for the town's survival. Adeline shared her warmth and her stores, not out of Christian charity, but out of a pragmatic understanding that a living community was better than a dead one. The change in her in-laws was not spoken, but enacted. It began with John. He appeared one morning with a set of iron hinges he had forged. "For the door," he said gruffly, not meeting her eye. "It'll seal better." He spent the day fitting it, his large, capable hands working with a silent, focused intensity. It was an apology made of iron and wood. Martha's offering was quieter. She arrived with a small cloth bag of seeds for the spring. "These are from my mother's garden," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They grow in shade." She began to visit, ostensibly to see Thomas, but she would sit for hours, her knitting needles clicking softly, the silence between her and Adeline no longer hostile, but heavy with unspoken things. They were two mothers, bound by their love for 2 generations of the same family line, their parallel griefs finally finding a place to coexist. The news of Samuel's passing, discovered when the thaw allowed for travel, settled a gentle melancholy over them. Adeline mourned the loss of her teacher, but she carried his knowledge in her hands and in her heart. She found the hidden chamber Daniel had mapped, a small grotto warmed by a steady current of air from deep within the earth. It was a perfect place for wintering the more delicate plants. The cave, once a symbol of her exile, had become a testament to the truth Samuel had taught her: the earth answers labor. It had answered hers, and in doing so, it had provided a space large enough for even the most fractured of families to begin to heal. The earth keeps its own time. Years pass like seasons, each leaving its mark, softening the sharp edges, deepening the roots. A decade after the great storm, the cave on the mountain was no longer a curiosity or a scandal, it was a landmark. Adeline's home had expanded. The cabin remained its heart, but a stone-walled greenhouse now covered the sunlit portion of the cave mouth, lush with produce year-round. A sturdy pen housed goats, and their milk and cheese were traded in the town below. The path to her door was well-worn, not by the desperate, but by friends. Thomas was a strong, thoughtful boy with his father's eyes and his mother's resilience. He knew the mountain secrets as well as she did, his hands as comfortable in the soil as they were with a book. John and Martha were grandparents, their visits a regular and gentle rhythm in his life. The shame that had driven them had long since been replaced by a quiet, wondering pride. They did not speak of the past, but its lessons were written on their faces, in the way they looked at their grandson, in the way they looked at the home their daughter-in-law had built not just from rock and timber, but from the ruins of their own making. Beatrice was a subdued, older woman who now spoke of Adeline with a kind of baffled awe. The social order she had once policed had been irrevocably altered by a force she could not comprehend: quiet competence. In the epilogue of her story, a new character appeared, quietly and without fanfare. Owen, the town's widowed schoolteacher, began making the trek up the mountain, bringing books for Thomas and staying for coffee. He was a man of gentle words and patient eyes, one who understood loss. There was no whirlwind romance, no passionate declaration, but in his company, Adeline found a quiet companionship that felt like the coming of a gentle spring after a long, hard winter. Sometimes, in the evening, she would stand at the cave mouth and look down at the twinkling lights of Providence. She would press her hand against the great, granite wall, feeling the deep, enduring warmth of the stone. It was the warmth of the earth, the warmth of a fire, the warmth of a life wrested from the cold. The world had given her a tomb, but the earth, in its patient memory, had given her a home.